I was grilling burgers on my back patio in suburban Denver, Colorado, when I heard the sharp clicking of heels on my driveway, followed by 3 aggressive knocks on my front door that echoed through my modest ranch-style home like gunshots. The wind chimes hanging from my porch beam swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, their soft melodic tones creating a peaceful soundtrack that I had enjoyed for the past 3 months since moving into the Meadowbrook Hills subdivision. I wiped my hands on my apron, left the burgers sizzling, and walked through my house to answer the door, completely unprepared for the chaos that was about to consume the next 6 weeks of my life. Standing on my doorstep was a woman I had seen once at the neighborhood meeting but never actually spoken to. She wore a crisp white blouse tucked into pressed khaki pants, her blonde hair cut in that distinctive speak-to-the-manager style that should have been my first warning. Her lips were pursed so tightly they had practically disappeared, and she clutched a leather-bound notebook against her chest like it was some kind of holy scripture. Behind her, parked at an angle that blocked half my driveway, sat a silver Mercedes SUV with a personalized plate that read "Ho Queen." "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my tone friendly despite the aggressive energy radiating from this woman. "I certainly hope so," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "My name is Patricia Vandermeer, and I am the president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association. I am here to discuss a very serious violation that you are currently committing on your property." I blinked at her, genuinely confused. I had moved into this neighborhood in January, and it was now early April. I had read through the HOA documents when I purchased the house, paid my quarterly dues on time, kept my lawn maintained, painted nothing unusual, built nothing new, and generally kept to myself while I settled into my new job as a software engineer at a tech company in downtown Denver. I had no idea what violation she could possibly be talking about. "I am not aware of any violations," I said carefully. "What seems to be the problem?" Patricia's eyes narrowed, and she uncrossed one arm from her notebook to point dramatically at my porch. "Those," she declared, her finger jabbing toward my wind chimes like she was identifying a criminal in a lineup. "Those wind chimes are a nuisance and a violation of our community standards. They must be removed immediately." I turned to look at the wind chimes in question. They were a birthday gift from my sister, made of brushed aluminum tubes that created gentle, harmonious tones when the wind passed through them. The whole assembly was maybe 18 inches long, hanging from a small hook I had installed in the overhang of my covered porch. They were tasteful, not gaudy, and certainly not loud. I had specifically chosen that spot because it was partially sheltered, so they only chimed when there was a decent breeze, not constantly. "I am sorry, but I do not understand," I said, turning back to Patricia. "These wind chimes are completely reasonable. They are not loud, they are not offensive, and they are on my own property." "What is the actual issue?" Patricia's face flushed pink, and her grip on her notebook tightened. "The issue, Mr. Morrison, is that they are not in compliance with our HOA regulations. I live 4 houses down and I can hear them from my backyard. They are disruptive and unacceptable." I tried to keep my expression neutral. 4 houses down. That seemed unlikely unless she had the hearing of a bat. The wind chimes barely made noise loud enough for me to hear them when I was standing right underneath them. "Could you show me the specific regulation that prohibits wind chimes?" I asked. I reviewed the HOA documents before I bought the house, and I did not see anything about them. "It falls under the General Nuisance Clause," Patricia said quickly, too quickly, like she had prepared this answer beforehand. "Any item that creates excessive noise or disturbs the peaceful enjoyment of neighboring properties is prohibited. Your wind chimes qualify." I had spent 10 years as a software engineer, which meant I had spent 10 years reading technical documentation, legal agreements, and terms of service. I knew how to parse language, and something about Patricia's response felt off. The wording was vague, the kind of catch-all phrase that HOAs often included but rarely enforced unless someone had a personal vendetta. "I would like to see that in writing," I said. "Could you provide me with the specific section number and the exact wording of the ordinance?" Patricia's flush deepened from pink to red. "I do not need to provide you with anything. I am the HOA president, and I am telling you that this is a violation. Remove the wind chimes within 48 hours, or you will face fines." "With all due respect, I am not removing anything until I see documentation that proves they violate an actual rule," I said, my own frustration starting to build. "This is my property, and I have a right to know exactly what regulation I am supposedly breaking." "You will receive formal notification in writing," Patricia snapped. She flipped open her notebook, scribbled something with a pen she yanked from her pocket, then tore out the page and thrust it at me. "Consider this your verbal warning. Expect the official letter within 3 business days." Before I could respond, she spun on her heel, marched back to her Mercedes, and drove away with more speed than was safe in a residential neighborhood. I looked down at the paper she had given me. It was barely legible, just a scrawled note that said wind chime removal required 48 hours p. Vandermeer. No reference to any specific rule, no section number, nothing that resembled an official document. I walked back through my house to the patio, where my burgers were now slightly charred around the edges. I flipped them onto a plate, turned off the grill, and sat down at my outdoor table. The wind chimes sang softly above me, their gentle tones now feeling like a small act of rebellion. I pulled out my phone and started researching Colorado HOA laws, because something about this entire interaction felt wrong. 3 days later, exactly as Patricia had promised, I received a formal letter in the mail. It arrived in a crisp white envelope with Meadowbrook Hills HOA printed in the return address corner. I opened it at my kitchen table, half expecting some legitimate documentation that would make me feel foolish for resisting. Instead, what I found was almost comically inadequate. The letter was typed on official HOA letterhead and signed by Patricia Vandermeer in her capacity as president. It stated that I was in violation of Section 7.3 of the HOA Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, which prohibited excessive noise and nuisances that disturb the quiet enjoyment of the community. It demanded that I remove the wind chimes within 7 days of receiving the letter or face a fine of $50 per day, until compliance was achieved. There was no specific mention of wind chimes, no decibel measurements, no definition of what constituted excessive noise, and no appeals process outlined in the letter. I pulled out my copy of the HOA documents that I had received when I closed on the house. I kept all important paperwork in a filing cabinet in my home office, organized by category. I found the CCRs and flipped to Section 7.3. The actual text read, "No owner shall engage in any activity or maintain any condition on their property that creates excessive noise, pollution, or other nuisances that substantially interfere with the reasonable use and enjoyment of other properties in the community." The word "substantially" was doing a lot of work in that sentence. My wind chimes, which could barely be heard beyond my own property line, certainly did not substantially interfere with anyone's reasonable enjoyment of their property. I took a video on my phone, walking from my front porch to the sidewalk, then down to the property line between my house and my neighbors. The wind chimes were almost inaudible once you moved more than 15 feet away from them. I decided to take a different approach. Instead of immediately challenging Patricia, I would talk to my neighbors and see if anyone else had actually complained about the wind chimes. If I was genuinely causing a problem, I wanted to know about it. But I suspected this was Patricia's personal crusade, not a community concern. My next-door neighbor to the left was a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Chen. She was in her 70s, spent most of her time gardening, and had been nothing but friendly since I moved in. I walked over on Saturday morning and found her kneeling in her flower beds, planting what looked like marigolds. "Good morning, Margaret," I called out as I approached her property line. She looked up and smiled, pushing herself to her feet with the help of a small gardening stool. "Good morning, dear. How are you settling in?" "Pretty well, actually." "I wanted to ask you something, though. Have my wind chimes been bothering you at all? The ones on my front porch?" Margaret looked genuinely puzzled. "Your wind chimes." "I can barely hear them, even when I am out here working. They are lovely, actually. Very soothing." "Why do you ask?" I explained the situation with Patricia, keeping my tone neutral and factual. Margaret's expression shifted from puzzled to annoyed as I spoke. "That woman," Margaret said, shaking her head, "she has been a thorn in this neighborhood's side for 5 years now. She got elected HOA president 3 years ago, and ever since, she has been on a power trip. Last year, she tried to fine the Johnsons for having the wrong shade of white on their mailbox. White. She claimed it was cream instead of pure white and that it violated the aesthetic standards. What happened with that? I asked. They fought it and won. Turned out there was no specification about mailbox color in the actual documents. Patricia just made it up, but it cost them time and stress, and I think that is what she enjoys. The control. I thanked Margaret and moved on to my neighbor on the right, a young couple named David and Melissa Torres, who both worked in healthcare. David answered the door in scrubs, clearly just home from a shift. "Hey, what's up?" he asked. I explained the wind chime situation again. David actually laughed. "Dude, we cannot even hear them. Our bedroom is on this side of the house, and we have never been woken up or disturbed or anything. Is Patricia bothering you about them? She is trying to make me remove them." "Yeah, that tracks." She sent us a letter last month about our trash cans being visible from the street. We keep them in the side yard, like barely visible if you walk by at exactly the right angle. She wanted us to build a privacy fence to hide them. We ignored the letter and she has not followed up yet. I think she just sends these things to see who will bend. This was becoming a clear pattern. I talked to 2 more neighbors that weekend, including one directly across the street. Nobody had complained about the wind chimes. Nobody had even noticed them as anything other than a pleasant background detail. Patricia was acting unilaterally, using her position to push her personal preferences onto the community. Monday morning, I drafted a response letter. I kept it professional and factual. I stated that I had reviewed Section 7.3 of the CCRs and determined that my wind chimes did not meet the threshold of substantially interfering with anyone's reasonable enjoyment of their property. I noted that I had spoken with multiple neighbors who confirmed they had no complaints. I requested that the HOA provide specific evidence of the nuisance, including decibel measurements, documented complaints from residents, or any other objective data that supported their claim. I stated that until such evidence was provided, I would not be removing the wind chimes, as they were a reasonable use of my own property. I sent the letter via certified mail so I would have proof of delivery. 2 days later, I received a phone call on my cell from a number I did not recognize. I answered, and Patricia's voice came through the speaker, tight with barely controlled anger. "Mr. Morrison, this is Patricia Vandermeer. I received your letter, and I want to make something very clear to you. This is not a negotiation. The HOA has determined that your wind chimes are a violation, and you will remove them, or you will be fined. Have you gathered any evidence to support your claim?" I asked calmly. "Decibel readings, complaints from other residents? I do not need evidence. I am the president of this HOA and I have the authority to enforce our standards." "Actually, you do not," I said, feeling my patience starting to fray. "You have the authority to enforce the rules as they are written in the CCRs. You do not have the authority to make up new rules or selectively enforce vague language based on your personal opinions. Unless you can provide evidence that my wind chimes substantially interfere with other residents, I am not removing them." "You are making a mistake," Patricia said, her voice dropping to something that sounded almost threatening. "This HOA has the power to place liens on your property. We can make your life very difficult. And I have the power to hire an attorney," I said. "If you want to pursue this, go ahead. But you should know that I have documented everything, including the fact that none of my neighbors have complained about the wind chimes. I think you will find that you are on very shaky legal ground." Patricia hung up without another word. I sat in my home office, staring at my phone, feeling a mix of frustration and disbelief. I had moved to this neighborhood for peace and quiet, to have a place to call my own after years of renting apartments. Instead, I was being harassed by a middle-aged woman on a power trip over a set of wind chimes that barely made any noise. The following Friday, I received another letter. This one was even more aggressive. It stated that I was now officially in violation and that fines of $50 per day would begin accruing as of that Monday. It also stated that if I did not comply within 30 days, the HOA would pursue a lien against my property to collect the fines. I did the math. $50 a day for 30 days was $1,500, plus whatever legal fees they might try to tack on. This was getting serious. More importantly, it was getting expensive, potentially. I had been hoping Patricia would back down once she realized I was not going to roll over, but she seemed to be doubling down instead. I spent that weekend researching attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes. I found a firm in Denver called Blackwell & Associates that had good reviews and a track record of representing homeowners against overreaching HOAs. Monday morning, I called their office and explained the situation to a paralegal who took detailed notes. She scheduled me for a consultation with one of their attorneys, Michael Blackwell, for Wednesday afternoon. Michael Blackwell's office was in a modern building in downtown Denver, all glass and steel with a view of the mountains in the distance. He was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with dark hair and the kind of sharp, focused energy that made me feel like he was already solving my problem before I finished explaining it. I walked him through the entire timeline, from Patricia's first visit to the most recent letter threatening fines and a lien. I brought copies of all the correspondence, photos and videos of the wind chimes, and notes from my conversations with neighbors. Michael reviewed everything carefully, occasionally jotting notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "This is exactly the kind of case I enjoy," he said. "Your HOA president is way out of bounds here. The CCRs are clear that any nuisance must substantially interfere with other residents. You have documented that no other residents are complaining, which undermines their entire case. The fact that they are threatening fines without any objective evidence is a problem for them." "What are my options?" I asked. "Well, the easiest and cheapest option is to have me send them a letter," Michael said. "A formal attorney letter outlining the weaknesses in their case and the potential legal consequences if they continue to pursue this. A lot of HOAs will back down immediately when they realize a homeowner has legal representation. They do not want to risk an actual lawsuit that could cost them thousands in legal fees, especially if they are likely to lose. And if they do not back down, then we escalate. We could request mediation, file a complaint with the Colorado Division of Real Estate, or, if necessary, file a lawsuit. But I do not think it will come to that." This is such a weak case that I would be shocked if they pushed forward once they get a letter from an attorney. How much will the letter cost? I asked. My retainer for a case like this is $500. That covers the initial letter and any immediate follow-up correspondence. If we have to go beyond that, we will discuss additional fees, but I am confident the letter will resolve this. I thought about it for maybe 30 seconds. $500 felt like a lot of money to spend on a wind chime dispute, but the alternative was either removing the wind chimes and letting Patricia win, or racking up thousands of dollars in fines for something I had every right to keep. Plus, this was not really about the wind chimes anymore. It was about standing up to someone who was abusing their authority. Let's do it, I said. I paid the retainer, and Michael assured me he would have a letter drafted and sent to the HOA within 2 business days. I left his office feeling, for the first time since this whole mess started, like I was not fighting this battle alone. True to his word, Michael sent me a draft of the letter on Friday morning for my approval. It was beautiful in the way that legal documents could be beautiful. It was professional but firm, laying out the facts of the case and the legal deficiencies in the HOA's position. It cited Colorado HOA law, referenced relevant case precedents, and made it clear that any attempt to fine me or place a lien on my property would be challenged in court. It requested that the HOA immediately cease its harassment and formally withdraw the violation notice. Michael sent the letter via certified mail and regular mail, and he copied me on both. The following week was quiet. I heard nothing from Patricia or the HOA. I started to hope that the letter had done its job and that this nightmare was finally over. I went to work, came home, grilled dinner on my patio, and listened to my wind chimes in peace. Then on Thursday evening, I heard a knock on my door. Not the aggressive pounding from before, but a hesitant, almost timid knock. I opened the door to find a man in his 60s standing on my porch. He was wearing a polo shirt and khakis, and he looked deeply uncomfortable. "Mr. Morrison? My name is Frank Jennings. I am the vice president of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" I invited him in, curious about what this visit was about. Frank sat on my couch and immediately started apologizing. "I want you to know that I had no idea Patricia was pursuing this wind chime issue until we received the letter from your attorney," he said. The HOA board is supposed to vote on enforcement actions, especially anything involving fines. Patricia never brought this to a board meeting. She was acting on her own. I felt a surge of anger. So she was threatening to fine me and put a lien on my property without any board approval? Exactly. When we got your attorney's letter, I called an emergency board meeting. We have 5 board members total, and I reached out to everyone except Patricia. All 4 of us agreed that this whole situation is absurd. Your wind chimes are not a nuisance. Patricia has been overstepping her authority for a while now, and this was the last straw. What happens now? I asked. We held a vote yesterday and removed Patricia as president. She is still on the board as a regular member, but she no longer has executive authority. I am serving as interim president until we can hold elections next month. We also voted to formally withdraw the violation notice and apologize to you for the harassment. There will be no fines, no liens, nothing. You are free to keep your wind chimes. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, followed quickly by frustration at how unnecessary this entire ordeal had been. I appreciate you coming here and telling me this. It has been a stressful few weeks, I can imagine, and there is one more thing. Frank hesitated, then continued. Because Patricia used HOA resources, including our letterhead and postage, to pursue a personal vendetta without board approval, we are holding her financially responsible for the costs this caused you. We know you hired an attorney. If you provide us with documentation of your legal fees, the HOA will reimburse you. I blinked in surprise. I had not expected that. Are you serious? Completely. The board voted unanimously. Patricia abused her position, and she needs to face consequences. We will be billing her personally for the amount we reimburse you. I thought about Patricia's smug face when she first showed up at my door, the way she had threatened me, and tried to use the HOA as a weapon to force her will on me. The idea of her having to personally pay for my attorney fees felt like justice. I will send you the invoice, I said. Frank and I talked for a few more minutes. He shared stories of other times Patricia had overstepped, and it became clear that I was not the first person she had targeted. I was just the first one who had pushed back hard enough to force the board to act. Before he left, Frank shook my hand and apologized again for everything I had been through. Over the next week, I worked with Michael to prepare a final invoice. His services had totaled $500 for the retainer, plus an additional $280 for the time he spent drafting the letter, reviewing the HOA's response, and handling the follow-up communication with the board. The total came to $780. I sent the invoice to Frank, and within 10 days, I received a check from the Meadowbrook Hills HOA for the full amount. A few days after I received the check, I ran into Patricia at the grocery store. I was in the produce section, picking out tomatoes, when I looked up and saw her standing near the lettuce, staring at me. She looked different than she had during our previous encounters. The aggressive confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked like barely contained fury mixed with humiliation. She walked over to me, her cart rolling loudly on the linoleum floor. "I hope you are happy," she said, her voice low and bitter. "I am, actually," I said. "I get to keep my wind chimes and I was reimbursed for my legal fees. Seems like a fair outcome to me." "You cost me $780. "No, you cost yourself $780. You could have left me alone. You could have followed proper procedure and brought your complaint to the board. Instead, you decided to abuse your authority and threaten me. This is the consequence." Patricia's face flushed red, and for a moment I thought she might actually yell at me in the middle of the grocery store, but she seemed to think better of it. She turned her cart around and walked away without another word. I never saw her at another HOA meeting after that. According to Frank, she resigned from the board entirely 2 weeks later. The aftermath of the wind chime war, as I started calling it in my head, had some unexpected positive effects on the neighborhood. Frank Jennings turned out to be an excellent interim president. He actually read the CCRs thoroughly and realized that many of the rules Patricia had been enforcing were not rules at all but her personal interpretations of vague language. He sent out a newsletter to all residents clarifying what the actual regulations were and establishing a formal process for reporting violations and appealing decisions. It brought a sense of transparency that had been missing under Patricia's leadership. I also became something of a minor hero among certain neighbors. Margaret Chen baked me a pie and told me I had done the whole neighborhood a service by standing up to Patricia. David and Melissa invited me to a barbecue and introduced me to several other neighbors who shared their own horror stories about Patricia's reign as HOA president. I learned that she had tried to fine one family for having a vegetable garden in their backyard, claiming it was unsightly, even though the backyard was completely fenced and not visible from any street or neighboring property. She had threatened another resident for having a basketball hoop in their driveway, saying it was a liability risk, despite there being no HOA rule about sports equipment. The more stories I heard, the more I realized how toxic Patricia had made the community. People were afraid to make any changes to their properties, even minor ones like planting new flowers or changing their doormat, because they never knew what might trigger a violation notice. The HOA had become a source of stress and anxiety instead of a tool for maintaining property values and community standards. under Frank's leadership, things began to change. He organized a community meeting where residents could voice their concerns and suggest improvements to the HOA governance. Nearly 50 people showed up, which was apparently a record. I attended and listened as people shared their experiences and ideas. Several residents proposed amending the CCRs to include more specific definitions of violations and establishing clearer procedures for enforcement. Others suggested implementing term limits for board positions to prevent anyone from accumulating too much power for too long. The meeting lasted over 2 hours, and by the end, there was a sense of energy and optimism that I had not felt since moving into the neighborhood. Frank appointed a committee to review the CCRs and propose amendments that would be voted on at the next annual meeting. I was surprised when several people suggested I join the committee, given that I was still a relatively new resident. I agreed, figuring it was a good way to make sure this kind of abuse did not happen again. Meanwhile, my wind chimes continued to hang on my front porch, singing softly in the breeze. Every time I heard them, I felt a small sense of satisfaction. They had become more than just a decoration. They were a symbol of the importance of standing up for your rights, even over something small. Because it was never really about the wind chimes. It was about not letting someone with a tiny bit of authority push you around just because they could. I also developed a deeper understanding of how HOAs could go wrong. In theory, they were a good idea. A group of neighbors coming together to maintain standards and protect property values made sense. But the system only worked if the people in charge acted in good faith and followed the rules. When someone like Patricia got into power and decided to use the HOA as a personal fiefdom, it could make people's lives miserable. I started researching HOA law more thoroughly, partly out of personal interest and partly to help the committee with the CCR review. I learned that Colorado had fairly strong protections for homeowners against overreaching HOAs, but many people did not know their rights. The law required HOAs to follow specific procedures before imposing fines, including providing notice, an opportunity to be heard, and a formal vote by the board. Patricia had skipped all of those steps. If I had not hired an attorney, I might not have known that her threats were essentially toothless. I also learned that HOAs could be held liable for damages if they acted outside their authority or violated their own governing documents. In extreme cases, individual board members could be personally sued if they acted with malice or gross negligence. The legal fees I had incurred were actually on the lower end of what could happen in these disputes. Some homeowners ended up spending tens of thousands of dollars fighting their HOAs, and some HOAs ended up bankrupt from lawsuits. The committee met several times over the next 2 months. We reviewed every section of the CCRs and identified areas that needed clarification. The noise ordinance section was one of our priorities. We proposed adding specific language that defined excessive noise as anything exceeding a certain decibel level measured from the property line, and we included exemptions for normal residential activities like lawn mowing, children playing, and reasonable decorative items like wind chimes. We also proposed requiring that all enforcement actions be approved by a majority vote of the board, and that homeowners be given at least 30 days to respond to any violation notice before fines could be imposed. Another important change we proposed was establishing an ombudsman position, a neutral third party who could mediate disputes between homeowners and the HOA before they escalated to legal action. This would provide a safety valve for situations where communication broke down or where homeowners felt they were being treated unfairly. The ombudsman would be elected by the community and could not be a current board member, ensuring independence. We presented our proposed amendments at the annual meeting in June. I was nervous about speaking in front of a large group, but I felt strongly about the changes we were proposing. I stood at the podium in the community clubhouse and explained how the vague language in the current CCRs had allowed for arbitrary enforcement. I shared my own experience with the wind chimes, not to embarrass Patricia, who was notably absent from the meeting, but to illustrate why specific objective standards were important. The amendments were put to a vote and they passed with over 80% approval. It felt like a real victory, not just for me, but for the entire community. We had taken a bad situation and used it as an opportunity to make things better for everyone. Frank was elected as the permanent HOA president in that same meeting, and he appointed a diverse board that included people from different age groups and backgrounds. I was asked if I wanted to run for a board position, but I declined. I had no desire to get that deeply involved in HOA politics. I was happy to help with specific projects, but I wanted to focus on my job and my personal life. As summer arrived, I spent more time enjoying my backyard. I set up a small vegetable garden, which was now explicitly allowed under the amended CCRs. I planted tomatoes, peppers, and zucchini, and I found the work of tending the garden to be surprisingly therapeutic after long days of staring at computer screens. My wind chimes continued to provide a pleasant soundtrack, and I never heard another word of complaint about them. One evening in late July, I was watering my garden when Margaret Chen walked over from her yard. She had a plate covered in aluminum foil in her hands. "I made too many cookies," she said with a smile. "Thought you might want some." I thanked her and invited her to sit on my patio. We talked for a while about gardening and the neighborhood. She mentioned that she had noticed a real difference in the community since the changes to the HOA governance. "People are friendlier now," she said. "They are not walking around worried about getting violation notices for silly things. It feels like an actual neighborhood again, not a police state." I laughed at her description, but I knew what she meant. There was a lightness that had not been there before. People waved when you drove by. Kids played in the streets without their parents worrying that someone would complain. It was the kind of community I had hoped for when I bought the house. Margaret left after finishing her cookies, and I sat on my patio as the sun set, listening to the wind chimes and watching the mountains turn purple in the fading light. I thought about everything that had happened over the past few months. It had been stressful and frustrating, but it had also taught me some important lessons. I had learned that standing up for yourself was worth it, even when it was uncomfortable. I had learned that communities functioned better when people communicated openly and followed fair procedures. And I had learned that small things like wind chimes could become symbols of larger principles. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Michael Blackwell, my attorney. Inside was a short note thanking me for being a client and mentioning that my case had been one of his favorites because it had such a clear-cut resolution. He also mentioned that if I ever needed legal help in the future, I should not hesitate to reach out. Tucked into the envelope was also a check for $50, which he explained was a refund for a portion of his time that ended up not being necessary since the case resolved so quickly. I was touched by the gesture. It was a small amount of money, but it showed integrity. Michael could have easily kept that $50, and I never would have known. Instead, he went out of his way to return it. It reinforced my belief that there were still good people out there who did the right thing, even when no one was watching. As autumn approached and the weather started to cool, I found myself reflecting on the entire experience with a sense of gratitude. Yes, Patricia had been a nightmare to deal with. Yes, the whole situation had been stressful and expensive and time-consuming, but it had also connected me more deeply to my community. I had met neighbors I might never have talked to otherwise. I had become involved in improving the HOA governance in ways that would benefit everyone. And I had proven to myself that I could stand up to someone trying to bully me. The wind chimes still hung on my porch, though I took them down during a particularly fierce windstorm in September to prevent them from getting damaged. When I rehung them a few days later, I noticed that the hook had loosened slightly, so I took the time to reinforce it properly. As I worked, David from next door walked by with his dog. "The famous wind chimes," he called out with a grin. "Glad they survived the storm." "Me too," I said. "They have been through a lot." "That they have." "Hey, Melissa and I are having some people over this Saturday for a bonfire. You should come." I agreed, and that Saturday, I found myself sitting around a fire pit in David and Melissa's backyard with about a dozen neighbors, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories. It was the kind of simple, pleasant evening that made me remember why I had wanted to buy a house in a neighborhood like this in the first place. The sense of community, the connections with the people who lived around you, the feeling of belonging somewhere. Someone brought up the wind chime incident, and it had already taken on a kind of legendary status in the neighborhood. People who had not even been directly involved knew the story, and it had become a cautionary tale about HOA overreach. A few people joked that I should get a plaque made for the wind chimes commemorating their role in neighborhood history. I laughed along, but part of me thought they might be onto something. As the year drew to a close, the Meadowbrook Hills HOA sent out its annual report to all residents. It included a financial summary, updates on community projects, and a note from Frank reflecting on the changes that had been implemented over the past year. He mentioned the amendment to the CCRs, the formation of the Ombudsman program, and the improved communication between the board and residents. He did not mention Patricia by name, but he referenced the importance of accountability and transparency in HOA governance. The financial summary showed that the HOA had actually saved money over the past year compared to the previous one. Under Patricia's leadership, the HOA had spent thousands on legal fees pursuing various enforcement actions, many of which had been dropped or resulted in no fines collected. Under Frank's leadership, there had been almost no legal expenses. Turns out that when you treated people fairly and followed reasonable rules, you did not end up in expensive legal battles. I also noticed a line item in the financial report for reimbursements and settlements that totaled $780. My $780. It was listed without details, but I knew exactly what it represented. I wondered if Patricia saw that line item and felt any regret for how she had handled things. Probably not. People like her rarely did. Winter arrived, bringing snow and cold that made me grateful for my cozy house. I decorated for the holidays, hanging lights along the porch and placing a wreath on my front door. I did not ask for HOA permission, because the amended CCRs clearly allowed seasonal decorations within reasonable limits. I smiled every time I looked at those lights, knowing that a year ago, I might have been afraid to put them up for fear of triggering another Patricia meltdown. On Christmas Eve, I was sitting in my living room with a cup of hot chocolate, watching the snow fall outside my window, when I heard the soft chiming of my wind chimes. I had left them up despite the cold, and even in winter they occasionally caught a breeze and sang. The sound was muted by the snow, but still clear enough to hear. It made me think about everything that had happened, all the stress and frustration, but also the growth and the positive changes that had come from it. I thought about Patricia and wondered what she was doing. I had not seen her around the neighborhood in months. According to Margaret, she had been keeping to herself, barely leaving her house except for necessities. Part of me felt a little sorry for her. She had built her identity around being HOA president, and when that was taken away, she did not seem to know who she was anymore. but mostly, I felt like she had brought it on herself. She had a choice at every step of the process to back down, to admit she was wrong, to follow proper procedures. She chose not to, and she paid the price. I also thought about the broader lessons from the experience. HOAs were not inherently bad, but they required good people in leadership who understood that their role was to serve the community, not to rule it. They required clear, fair rules that were applied consistently. And they required homeowners who were willing to speak up when things went wrong, even when it was uncomfortable or costly to do so. As the new year began, I set some personal goals. I wanted to get more involved in the community, not through the HOA necessarily, but through other means. I started volunteering at a local food bank one Saturday a month. I joined a hiking group that explored the trails in the mountains outside Denver. I made an effort to have my neighbors over for dinner more often, building the relationships that made a neighborhood feel like home. The wind chimes remained on my porch through winter, spring, and into the next summer. They weathered storms and sunshine, wind and calm. They chimed softly through my morning coffee and evening dinners. And every time I heard them, I remembered what they represented: the importance of standing your ground, the value of community, and the satisfaction of knowing you did the right thing even when it was hard. I never did get that commemorative plaque made, but in a way, I did not need one. The wind chimes themselves were the memorial to that strange, stressful, ultimately worthwhile battle. They hung there as a reminder that sometimes the smallest things are worth fighting for, not because they are important in themselves, but because of the principles they represent. Looking back on the whole experience from the perspective of time and distance, I could see how it had changed me. I was more confident now, more willing to speak up when something was not right. I was more connected to my neighbors and my community. I understood my rights as a homeowner better, and I was not afraid to assert them when necessary. And I had learned that hiring a good attorney was sometimes the best $780 you could spend. The story could have ended badly. I could have backed down and removed the wind chimes, setting a precedent that Patricia could bully anyone into compliance. The HOA board could have backed Patricia instead of holding her accountable, leading to an expensive lawsuit that might have dragged on for years. But instead, things worked out about as well as they could have. Justice was served, the community benefited, and I got to keep my wind chimes. As I sit here now on my porch, typing this account on my laptop while the wind chimes sing in the background, I feel a sense of peace. The whole ordeal with Patricia feels like ancient history, even though it was just over a year ago. The neighborhood has moved on, the HOA is functioning better than ever, and life is good. I still see Frank around occasionally, and we always chat for a few minutes. He tells me about the latest HOA projects, all of which sound reasonable and beneficial. New playground equipment for the community park, a neighborhood watch program, a quarterly newsletter that actually contains useful information instead of just violation notices. The HOA is doing what it was supposed to do all along, making the neighborhood better for everyone who lives here. And my wind chimes. They are still hanging strong, their gentle melody a constant in the changing seasons. They have survived fierce storms, heavy snow, intense summer heat, and one very angry HOA president. They are just metal tubes on strings, nothing special or fancy. But to me, they represent something important. They represent the idea that your home should be your sanctuary, a place where you can be yourself without fear of arbitrary rules or petty tyrants. They represent the principle that authority must be exercised responsibly and with accountability. And they represent the simple truth that sometimes, standing up for something small can lead to something much bigger and more meaningful. The cost of fighting for those principles was $780 in attorney fees, some stress, and a fair amount of time and energy. But the return on that investment was immeasurable. A better community, stronger relationships with my neighbors, personal growth, and the satisfaction of knowing I did the right thing. It was worth every penny, and the best part, Patricia had to pay for it. That $780 came directly out of her pocket as a consequence of her abuse of power. It was not a huge amount of money in the grand scheme of things, but it was enough to send a clear message. Actions have consequences, and you cannot bully people without eventually facing accountability. So here I sit, comfortable in my home, listening to my wind chimes, grateful for how things turned out. The whole experience taught me that being a homeowner means more than just paying your mortgage and mowing your lawn. It means being engaged with your community, understanding your rights and responsibilities, and being willing to fight for what is fair and reasonable. It means not letting fear or inconvenience stop you from standing up to injustice, even when that injustice is relatively small in the grand scheme of things. Because at the end of the day, this was not really about wind chimes at all. It was about respect, fairness, and the kind of community we want to live in. It was about making sure that the people who hold positions of authority use that authority wisely and justly. It was about proving that regular people can push back against those who abuse their power and can win. My wind chimes still hang on my porch today, and I expect they will hang there for many years to come. They will continue to sing in the breeze, marking the passing seasons and reminding me of an important chapter in my life. A chapter where I learned to stand my ground, where I discovered the value of community, and where I proved to myself that doing the right thing, even when it is difficult, is always worth it in the end. The $780 that it cost Patricia to reimburse my legal fees was not just a financial penalty. It was a symbol of justice served, a reminder that abuse of power will ultimately be held accountable, and a small but significant victory for homeowners everywhere who have been bullied by overreaching HOAs. And every time those wind chimes sing, I remember that victory and smile.